There's something your brain did before you were old enough to choose it, before your first classroom, before your first textbook, before anyone handed you a grammar rule or corrected your pronunciation. Your brain was already listening. It was already learning. It was already being shaped, not by what you studied, but by what surrounded you, by the voices in the room when you were an infant, by the sounds your mother made before you understood what words even meant, by a language or several that wired your neural architecture in ways that will follow you for the rest of your life. And here's the part that no one tells you cleanly. That wiring never fully disappears. No matter how many years you spend in a new country, no matter how many hours you practice, no matter how many times someone tells you that you almost sound native, that early imprint, what linguists call the phonological substrate, remains. It bends your tongue. It shapes your jaw. It filters sound through patterns your brain learned in the first years of life. And for hundreds of millions of people on this planet, it means that they will carry an accent in a second language for their entire lives, not because they are not intelligent enough, not because they did not try hard enough, but because that is how human brains actually work. This is not a failure story. This is a biology story. And it is deeper, stranger, and more fascinating than most people ever realize. For a long time, the dominant assumption was fairly simple. Accents were seen as a problem of effort, a gap in learning, a sign that someone had not yet fully acquired a language, a temporary imperfection to be corrected, polished away, eventually erased with enough practice and immersion. Linguists and language teachers largely operated on this model for decades. The goal of second language acquisition was, in many educational systems, native-like proficiency, native-like pronunciation. The accent was the obstacle. Removal of the accent was the destination. This was not a cruel theory. It emerged from genuine observations. Children who moved to new countries at very young ages did often acquire near-native accents. Adults who moved later often did not. The conclusion seemed logical. Early exposure leads to better outcomes. Learn earlier, sound more native. The earlier the better. But embedded in that tidy conclusion were assumptions that researchers would eventually have to revisit, because the story of why children acquire accents differently than adults, and why adults from certain linguistic backgrounds struggle with certain sounds more than others, and why some people remain permanently marked by their first language no matter how long they live abroad. That story was not simple at all. The first cracks appeared in an unexpected place. Not in the sounds adults were getting wrong, but in the sounds they could not even hear. This became known in linguistics as the problem of perceptual categories, and it would change the way researchers understood accent formation entirely. If you were raised speaking Japanese, your auditory system learned to treat certain sounds as functionally equivalent. The distinction between the English sounds represented by L and R, a distinction that feels obvious to English listeners, was not a meaningful contrast in your early sound environment. So your brain, being extraordinarily efficient, stopped maintaining a sharp boundary between those two signals. It was not that Japanese speakers could not produce the sounds physically. It was that their neuroperceptual system had learned not to distinguish them at the level of meaning. When they heard the difference, it was like asking someone to distinguish between two shades of a color they had never been trained to separate. The sound arrived. The distinction did not. This was not a problem of intelligence. It was a problem of neural architecture. The brain had been tuned, and tuning, it turns out, is not easily undone. Researchers like Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington developed the concept of the perceptual magnet effect to describe what was happening. In infancy, roughly between 6 and 12 months of age, the human brain begins committing to the phonological categories of the surrounding language. Sounds that fall near a category prototype get pulled toward it, perceived as belonging to that category even when they are acoustically distinct. The brain is not passively recording sounds. It is actively organizing them, building a perceptual map that will serve communication in that language environment. It becomes remarkably efficient at that task. And efficiency in neural systems tends to create rigidity. By the end of the first year of life, studies suggest infants are already losing sensitivity to sound distinctions that are not relevant in their native language, distinctions they could perceive just months earlier before the native language began to dominate. Their acoustic environment, before the age of 1, Your brain is already narrowing its acoustic world. That finding alone should change how you think about accent. Because what it tells you is this: an accent in a second language is not primarily a mouth problem. It is a brain problem. And more precisely, it is a timing problem. The brain's phonological window, the period during which it is maximally flexible, maximally receptive to building new sound categories from scratch, is not indefinitely open. It begins closing. Gradually, asymptotically, it closes. And the sound you did not encounter inside that window will always, at some level, require more effort, more conscious override, more deliberate mapping than the sounds you learned before it narrowed. This is what linguists and cognitive scientists now broadly refer to as a critical period hypothesis. And while the exact boundaries of this window remain a subject of active research and genuine scientific debate, the core observation holds across dozens of studies. Second language phonology acquired before early childhood tends to be neurologically integrated in ways that resemble first language phonology. Second language phonology acquired later does not entirely. But here is where the story gets more interesting, because researchers began to notice that it was not just timing that determined accents. It was also the distance between languages. If you were raised in Spanish and you then acquired Italian or Portuguese, your accent in the new language was likely to be less pronounced than if you were raised in Korean and then acquired German. The linguistic distance, the structural, phonological, and prosodic gap between the two languages, mattered enormously. And this raised a deeper question. Why should it? The critical period had already passed for adult learners in either case. Why was the mother tongue still shaping the accent so differently depending on what that mother tongue was? The answer led researchers into the architecture of prosody. Not just individual sounds, but the rhythm, stress, and intonation patterns that give a language its musical signature. English, for example, is what linguists call a stress-time language, meaning its rhythm is organized around a regular pulse of stressed syllables, with unstressed syllables compressed or reduced in between. Languages like French and Spanish are generally described as syllable-timed. Each syllable receives relatively equal duration. Languages like Japanese have been analyzed as moritimed. These are different architectures of time, different rhythmic contracts with the ear. And when you learn a second language, you are not just learning new sounds. You are learning a new rhythmic system, a new temporal grammar of speech. And your native prosody, the rhythm your brain internalized in infancy, follows you into that new system like a shadow. When a native speaker of a syllable-timed language speaks English, they often give each syllable roughly equal weight. The reductions don't happen automatically. The compressed syllables don't compress. The rhythm doesn't sync. And native English listeners perceive this immediately, not because they are analyzing individual sounds, but because the prosody is wrong. The accent is not just in the vowels. It is in the time signature of the sentence. This is why even people who have spent decades abroad, who have carefully corrected every vowel, who have memorized every pronunciation rule, this is why even they are often still audibly marked by their first language, because prosody is not a rule you memorize. It is a pattern your brain internalized before you had words. If you have ever wondered why your accent feels involuntary, why it returns when you are tired, emotional, speaking quickly, not monitoring closely, this is the reason. The first language is not a layer on top of the second. It is underneath it. It is the foundation the second language was built on. And foundations do not disappear when you add new floors. Subscribe if you find yourself in any of this, because the science of how language shapes who we are goes far deeper than most of us were ever told. There is another dimension to this story that most people rarely encounter, and it comes from neuroscience rather than linguistics. Researchers studying bilingual and multilingual brains began to notice something unexpected. The brains of people who acquired two languages simultaneously from early childhood, simultaneous bilinguals, showed neurological patterns that were fundamentally different from those who acquired a second language later in life. Sequential learners. In simultaneous bilinguals, both languages were often represented in overlapping cortical regions. In late learners, the two languages frequently showed distinct, somewhat separated neural representations. The architecture was different, not deficient, but different. And that difference has implications for accent, for fluency under stress, for the automatic versus the deliberate, When you are operating from an overlapping, deeply integrated neural representation, the language flows from a common source. When you are operating from a partly separated system, there is, at some level, a translation process happening beneath consciousness, a reaching across a neural bridge that takes microseconds but leaves traces in timing and rhythm, in the subtle hesitations that mark non-native speech, even when no individual sound is wrong. What this means, in human terms, is significant. It means that the accent you carry is not a performance error. It is an honest expression of your neural history. It is a record of when and where and how your brain first met language. It is a kind of geographical and temporal signature pressed into the very way you produce sound. There are those who have used this to argue that accents should be embraced rather than erased. And while that is a social and political conversation that extends beyond neuroscience, what science does clearly say is this. The goal of eliminating an adult accent entirely through instruction is, for most people, not neuroscientifically realistic. Improvement is real. Intelligibility gains are real. But the deep prosodic imprint of the first language is extraordinarily persistent. It is not a language learning failure. It is a feature of how human neural development works. Imagine, for a moment, a child growing up in a household where 3 languages move through the rooms like weather. One language from the grandmother in the kitchen, another from the television in the corner, another from the older siblings who have already been to school and come back with something new on their tongues. This child is not learning phonology from a textbook. This child is absorbing 3 rhythmic systems, 3 prosodic architectures, 3 sets of perceptual categories, simultaneously, effortlessly, in the years when the brain is still building its acoustic map of the world. That child's linguistic brain will be built differently than the brain of a child who grew up with only one language flowing through the house. Not better or worse, but differently structured, more acoustically flexible in some ways, more complex in its internal organization, more capable of moving between systems, but also, perhaps, carrying traces of all 3 in ways that never fully resolve. This is a linguistic reality of enormous portions of the human population, in multilingual regions, in immigrant communities, in places where colonial history left 2 or more languages permanently in contact and competition. For these speakers, the question of accent is not simply about whether you sound native. It is about which language gets to be native, which prosodic architecture gets to be the default, which voice gets to be the one that requires no effort. Those are not just neuroscientific questions. They are identity questions. And they are embedded in the architecture of every brain that has ever tried to hold more than one language at once. Researchers are still working to fully understand the outer boundaries of what is possible. There are documented cases of adults who acquired second languages at late ages and achieved pronunciation so close to native-like that trained phoneticians could not reliably distinguish them from true natives. These are real. They matter, but they are exceptional. And understanding why they are exceptional, what neurological or environmental conditions produce that unusual outcome, is itself an active and unresolved research question. What is not exceptional? What is, in fact, the statistical norm across the global population of second language learners? It is a persistent accent, the voice that carries the geography of its first language into every new language it touches, the brain that learned the world through one set of sounds and built a second, third, fourth language on that original foundation. That is not a flaw in the human system. That is the human system. The brain does not start over when you meet a new language. It integrates. It adapts. It builds. But it builds on what was already there. And what was already there was laid down before you could read, before you could choose, before you even understood what language was. It was laid down by the voices around you in the first months of your life. In whatever place, in whatever sound world, you first arrived. Your accent, in the end, is not evidence of what you failed to learn. It is evidence of everything your brain already knew before the learning began. And that is a story far larger, far older, and far more human than any classroom ever told you. Subscribe, because the architecture of the human mind and everything language reveals about it is one of the deepest mysteries we are still only beginning to understand.